Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Gaudium at Space22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I am really making up for lost time. As you know, for about 10 days, I had no podcast for a lot of reasons, taking a break to do some writing, also suffering from the sinus infection from hell, and just the general winter doldrums since winter is the home of the Antichrist. So it's just had me down. But I'm making up for it because in the next 10 days, there's like seven or eight podcasts. Did one this morning and doing this one now. Anyway, so I'm welcoming two repeat victims of the podcast. First and foremost is our guest of honor, Dr. David Deane, who is still associate professor, or have you been
Yep.
promoted yet?
No.
Associate professor of theology at the Atlantic School of Theology up in Canada. Uh, Dr. Deane is from Ireland originally. He's not Canadian, but that is where he finds himself. We go to where the jobs are, don't we, Dr. Deane?
I do.
If you'd have told me I was going to spend most of my adult life near Allentown, Pennsylvania, teaching at this little DeSales University, I'd have thought you were nuts. But there it was. So we're going to be talking today about, and my colleague, my often podcasting sidekick, my former colleague and dear friend, Dr. Rodney Howsare, professor of theology, not for much longer, DeSales University, soon to be working at a seminary down in Florida, in Boynton Beach, Florida, right? So it's St. Vincent de Paul Regional Seminary, which I think is developing into quite a good place. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about a paper that Dr. Deane will be giving this Thursday. And the title of the paper is J.D. Vance, Catholicism and the New Right. And there's going to be a sort of hefty discussion today of, in some ways, of the role of St. Augustine in a lot of the post-liberal Catholic thinkers out there, guys like Deane, Peckold, Beth K. Elstein, people like that. So anyway, without further ado, welcome to the show, Dr. Deane and Dr. Hauser.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Larry, and great to see you, Rodney. I think you could have ended up in worse places than Allentown,
Yeah, yeah.
the
I
home of the pig
actually,
dogs. Like, it's
yeah, the Iron Pigs, I think they're
Iron
called.
Pigs, are they?
Yeah, the Iron Pigs. But
Excellent.
I have to say, in defense of Allentown, I eventually fell in love with the Lehigh Valley. I think the Lehigh Valley is a really great place to be and a great place to live. Don't you agree, Rodney?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Other than the fact you're not going to miss winter, the fact is, I think you will miss the Lehigh Valley.
I will. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's a nice
Is it a
place.
blue collar spot?
Used to be. Now it's morphing
Right.
more into white collar. A lot of colleges and universities, a lot of hospitals and doctors' offices, you know. So and it's kind of a tech place too. When the steel and Bethlehem Steel went out of business, they had to sort of reinvent themselves like so many other Rust Belt cities. But they
Right.
did. They really did. I enjoyed living there. Anyway, enough of that banter. Let's move on then to Dr. Deane. Please, if you will, uh, give us your reasons why you decided that this was the time to write an article as politically sort of filled with landmines potentially as J.D. Vance, Catholicism and the New Right.
Yeah. Well, I think, I'm on sabbatical right now. And so I wanted to do some reading on areas that were not entirely in my wheelhouse. And so I wanted to explore some of the things happening within Catholic post-liberalism, and also integralism, which was largely anathema to my instincts. And But it was a really good opportunity to do that. Also, JD Vance is a very, very fascinating character. He, I think, along with many others, represent the beginning of the end of liberalism in some ways. I think there are signs that liberalism as a philosophical discourse has simply run aground and is maintained only by the totems and the taboos that are produced by the cathedral. One of the things that is sort of was fascinating in my research into into the new right and the Catholic post-liberal right is this notion of the cathedral, which in the medieval world obviously was alongside the court. It was the place that gave legitimacy to the political regime. It was the place that established the totems and the taboos and the discourse. And for many of these figures, the media and the universities play that role now as the first estate, as the place that conveys legitimacy on political ideology and establishes the totems and taboos by which we live. Um, and that phrase that like the totems and the taboos, I think are really interesting because to me at least, because in the tyranny of the banal, I looked at how Renaissance Catholicism, to a certain extent, forgot its core rationale and ended up with a simple legalism, because some of the logic of how the moral life works started to become a little bit hazy. Liberalism is very much in the same place. The inconsistencies, the incoherency of much liberalism has been replaced by a simple set of totems and taboos. People who say this are good, people who say this are bad. And Vance, following on from Deane, Pecknold, Vermeule, a whole host of other thinkers, are really committed to some kind of regime change, changing how we do politics, changing how we do culture. It's an example that when people hear me giving, they sort of recoil because they're not Lenin fans in general. I'm much more sympathetic to Lenin, but Lenin in what is to be done, Rodney
Yeah, Rodney left.
has been apparated. But yes, in what is to be done, Lenin notes that genuine regime change involved shaping how people think and desire. And this can't be done simply by legislation. There has to be changes to the culture. And there's a sense in which that what we've seen in the first 3 or 4 weeks of the Trump presidency is in some ways an expression of the Vance, Deane, Pecknold awareness that we need to make changes at the level of culture in order to shape a society more attentive to the common good in which we can have human flourishing. So for all
Yeah.
these reasons, I wanted to study. I wanted to use J.D. Vance as the figure which would be the Trojan horse into this worldview. And of course, here in Canada, people are very, very concerned about the Trump presidency and about J.D. Vance as well. And so this is an opportunity to explore it and to converse about it and to speak about the positive aspects, the nuanced aspects, the sophisticated aspects, as well as I'll go on in the end to touch on some slight tensions between Augustine and Aquinas and the people they draw on, and some of the expressions of contemporary post-liberal nationalism. But this is in the context of so the first part of my paper talks about the significant growth in Catholicism in terms of conversions. That Vance is one of a legion of young people who have followed that same path from atheism to radical suspicion and rejection of liberal culture to a form of Augustine-inspired Christianity. There are countless figures like him. The seminaries are increasingly populated by young men who think like this, and so. I think for any of us who are interested in the future of Catholicism, we've got to be interested in the future of this, what looks likely to be the new Catholic leadership caste, and to identify and praise and celebrate the positives and the exciting things there. And I think the radical rejection of liberalism, as we find in the Deane, is good, and we can speak more about that later. But then also to flag some of the tensions, which I think this this theological trajectory and political trajectory needs to work through if it is to remain ever faithful to Catholicism, which is also part of it. So yeah, for all those reasons, I thought this was a good way of spending, 3 or 4 weeks, and that's what
Yeah.
I've been doing, and it comes to an end on Thursday night with this paper.
Well, that's great. You're on sabbatical, and not to change the topic, but I remember when I was on sabbatical a couple of times, and to all those young scholars just starting out in your academic careers out there, a piece of advice when you go to apply for a sabbatical: keep your ambitions low. Don't promise the moon, because then your provost is going to want to know, well, where's your 10 books you promised when you're
Exactly.
here. So
Yes.
I think if I
Yeah.
ever applied for sabbatical again, had I stated, I would have put down as my goal, I wish to blurb 5 books. I'm going to write a blurb on 5 books. Done. All right. Anyway, that's great. I think that is a noble thing to be spending your sabbatical on, is because it's such a pertinent study. I could launch into several questions, but Howsare, one of the reasons why I always like having Rodney on the show with me when we do these conversations with Dr. Deane is because Rodney knows a lot more political theory than I do, a lot more political philosophy than I do. So I'm going to turn to you, Howsare, dude, to see if you have any initial questions that you want to, or comments you want to make.
No, this is all very, very interesting to me, and I agree, David. This is like an interesting moment to be in the church, and it's also always these kind of moments are always fraught with a lot of possibilities on the one hand and massive dangers on
Mhm.
the other. And I'm curious as we talk today to kind of maybe hopefully we can unpack. And I'm just getting into this myself. I mean, I wrote my master's thesis on Leo Strauss and political philosophy. And so I've been interested in political theory and political theology, kind of from the beginning. Balthasar was kind of a detour for me because there are implications in his thought, but he's very apolitical. He's kind of
Right.
he's up doing the transcendentals and stuff. He's too busy
He's in the world of forms.
Yeah.
exactly right. So, but it's interesting to me as I'm kind of learning more about this stuff that there's not just post-liberalism, right? There's post-liberalisms, and
Mhm.
they're very different. I mean, in some ways, they can even be kind of fiercely contradictory to each other. Uh, and it might be interesting to talk about some of those. I'm not sure how much you've had a chance to kind of look at the varieties out there. And to me, again, I'm still trying to get a handle on what the differences are. But let me just say something autobiographical, because
Yeah.
I think what you just said about at the very end there about the people coming into the church right now. It's interesting that what happened to me when I started writing on Strauss as a master's student, I had read Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind, and that was the first time I had ever encountered somebody call into question modernity in a radical way like that, like the possibility that maybe modernity really got some things wrong. Because prior to that, I was just a full-on neocon,
Oh,
neoliberal.
right.
That's where I was,
A
100%.
first things Richard Newhouse Catholic.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. That's what I was a first thing subscriber, although
I was too. National Review, Bill Buckley, the whole bit.
yes, yeah, exactly. And now it's funny because Bloom and some of his ilk are still kind of cozy with the neocons, but at the same time, the Straussians will raise very, very fundamental questions about classical liberalism and sort of show you that this pre-modern tradition is really important and you don't want to just turn your back on it. Strangely, that was the beginning of my road to the Catholic Church, because the possibility that modernity didn't get everything right and that the past got everything wrong was now really became real to me as I began to realize, like, wow, Aristotle really has a lot of wisdom about politics that liberals just don't even pay attention to. It's very quote anti-liberal, et cetera. I just want to, kind of affirm what you said, that my path into the Catholic Church was at least in part as a result of my rejection of at least hook, line, and sinker classical liberalism. And I think that is happening to a lot of people. Now, the question,
Yeah.
of course, that always comes up is, okay, in other words, liberalism has been the only game in town for so long. The question, what else is there, is a really seriously anxiety-inducing sort of question, at least to me. Like, what's the alternative? That's kind of usually a conversation stopper, but I don't mean it that way. I mean, I kind of mean, I believe that liberalism is kind of coming to a bit of a crashing halt, and there has to be something there to pick up the pieces. And so maybe hopefully we can have a little bit of a constructive conversation towards that kind of a vision, maybe as we go on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the terrifying things and it's why Vance has certain elements, and people would laugh at this of Lenin in my thinking, because there's a sense that Lenin is such a lunatic by virtue of the fact that all that theory that people talk about, he goes, okay, let's make it happen. And
Yeah.
Vance is actually, and it's scary. You know, you go, absolutely, yeah, I'm 100% on board. Absolutely, this Obesian thing has got to go. Liberal modernity has got to go. Absolutely. Oh shit, he's actually doing
Yeah.
it.
Oh,
You know,
frick. Yeah.
that's that's a really, a really scary thing. But yes, I think there's, the post-liberalism that this is not your father's post-liberalism. Um, in that, I remember probably my earliest, engagement with forms of post-liberalism was, Yale School, theological post-liberalism,
Yes.
Lindbeck, Plaker, people like that. And in some ways, the contemporary Catholic post-liberals would see this as one more form of liberalism by virtue of the fact that it is, in a sense, ghettoized might be too strong, but it's certainly sealed within a linguistic framework. That the tradition or scripture provides the linguistic framework through which we experience the world, and so we can abide within our, in our tradition, in a certain ghetto within an overall liberal social order, which again cedes to liberalism normative status and accepts this ghettoization, which for someone like Deane or Pecknold is simply one more form of liberalism. This is a a form of post-liberalism which seeks to, Deneen, and one of the things which I think, is very enticing about this for me is that for me, which didn't come from the Bill Buckley side, but came from a sort of a more Marx side, that there's a sense in which Marx's insight that all of hitherto history, social history at least, is a history of class struggle, that's what has been exposed by contemporary, post-liberalism, that liberalism has brutalized the working class and will continue to brutalize the working class, and that this is not a bug in liberalism, this is a feature. That as soon as liberalism identifies the individual and individual rights as totemic, then anything which can restrict that, so for example, the family, the church, communities, social orders, must be opposed in the flagrant affirmation of individual liberty. But what this leads to is brutally unhappy people who are ripped apart from the things that give their life meaning. And this brutal unhappiness is not actually a problem for liberalism, because what we do in our brutal unhappiness is we consume. We purchase things, we eat things, we drink things, we we take drugs, we do all these things, which is perfect for the for the elites, for the bourgeoisie, who can sort of keep us in this fragmented farm animal existence. No offense, Larry, where
None
not the
taken.
good farm animals. Think a duck being fed for foie gras, just constantly consuming, miserable, hating life, and that's perfectly fine as long as they triumph. And so what these post-liberals want is, how do we create a society and how do we shape a social order which seeks to overcome this and build the common good and lead to greater happiness for people, that then becomes the challenge. And so it's a less pluralist, less ghettoized post-liberalism than the earlier forms. It's more ambitious and also more threatening because of that. Um, and also perhaps like more liberating because of that. Again, one of the things which Vance and Deneen and people like that talk about is the milkman. That there was a society in which a milkman could earn enough money through delivering milk to have a home, to have a family, his wife might not have been working, his children could be raised and could be educated, and this is a society in which there could be, a flourishing of a common good, as per your conversation recently with Andrew Wheeler-Jones, Larry. Um,
Yeah.
and that liberal society has made that absolutely impossible and reduced this figure, the former milkman, to the level of a miserable consumer who seeks to purchase his way beyond the despair that liberal society has placed him within. And liberal society simply milks him, and instead of him being, a contributing member of society, flourishing as a person, flourishing as a member of a community, flourishing in relationship with God, he now is the cow being milked by the liberal
Wow.
system.
Yeah.
Wow, that is so well said. I swear, I think you're a brother by a different mother, as they like to say, because you've just put into words so many ideas so beautifully expressive of my own discontent with the post-liberal order. And what I like too is, as I often say to people when I go on a sort of extended commentary on the ills of our society, I say, I'm not being judgmental. I'm a leper preaching to other lepers. I'm infected with the
Right.
same bacillus as all of you. I swim in the collective of concupiscence that our culture has created.
Yeah.
The bourgeois cult of well-being, as Bourdieu calls it, and others, and Monnier and others, the bourgeois cult of well-being. I live that, I breathe that, and it's precisely because I feel it in myself, and the anomic agonism that it creates within you, a slow crucifixion, spiritually speaking, that you rise up and you're angry, which makes you then prone towards being open to any movement that comes along and says to you, yeah, that's shit. Here's a better
Mhm.
way over here, you know? And so I guess that goes to Rodney's point then about, okay, there are post-liberalisms and they're all feeding in, they're all promising us lepers cures for our leprosy if we'll just come down this path over here. How do we, so let's, how do we adjudicate this then as Catholics? Because there are different forms of Catholic post-liberalism. I mean, I think as you indicated to me in a text like a month ago or a couple weeks ago when we first saw, J.D. Vance is the coming together of a couple of different streams of thought here. We've got the stream of technofeudalism, as Steve Bannon calls it, of people like Peter
Yeah.
Thiel and Elon Musk coming together with the more old-fashioned Augustinianism of Patrick Deane, Chad Pecknold. Um, and it's hard to tell, therefore, because JD has not given us an advanced theoretical apparatus for interpreting where he's going. So where is he going? Please sort of comment on these various tributaries that are feeding into JD Vance's version of post-liberalism as you see it.
Interestingly, Jonathan Liedl, I think
Register.
from the Register, yeah, JD Vance replied to him recently on X and mentioned that the idea of two different fathers, two different forces in competition in the Trump administration were overblown. But what was interesting about that is he didn't say they didn't exist, and so there is, I think, a clear tension between techno-feudalism, between the likes of Elon Musk, and then people like Vance who have a different perspective. Vance wrote of a very wonderful um, account of his conversion in The Lamp, where he talks about the influence of Rene Girard, and then he talked about Augustine, and he quoted long sections of Augustine, all of which are in keeping with this and with the way that the dominant elements in society um, rip the rip what Augustine didn't call the proletariat, rip the proletariat away from the institutions, the faith, the familial structures that give meaning to their lives, so they can reduce them to the level of a consumer that they can then buy with bread and circuses. And it was clear that Vance's use of Augustine here was almost like a sort of a mission statement for, for how he was imagining, a social order to, to function. And then the society, or the government, or the state, would have quite a hands-on role in seeking to shape a society in which you can have, milkmen. And so his position on immigration, for example, is, I think, so we mentioned at the start before we hit record, my hometown in Tipperary. And this is a town which was in the news for the first time in its entire history recently, because there were massive protests against immigration in my little town. And these people were called fascists and racists and all the kind of things that you would call them. And I know these people, and they are many things. They are, they're lovers, they're fighters, they're all these things, but they're not fascists and racists. The problem that they have is that they're in a very, very small town with very few facilities. And in the government, in order to appease their European overlords, are taking in massive amounts of immigrants, and therefore creating a good brand for Ireland that can bring in multinational corporations, and then they're foisting them not in the equivalent of Palo Alto, or posh areas in Ireland, but they're throwing them into deprived working class areas. And so all of a sudden, these working class areas, now they reduce their capacity, they're like the healthcare system, which are overloaded by these people. The Every single tradesperson in town has ceased to be viable, because there's no point being a fully unionized carpenter when all of a sudden there's a dude from Ukraine who's going to do it for, for half the price. And so all of a sudden, the working class, it's like the government is banging this drum to show our virtue to the world, but it's the working class that are being beaten by these sticks. And so when JD Vance is thinking about immigration first and foremost, these are the things I think that he's thinking about. Now we can, and I'm sure will, get to the significant problems there, but he is attentive to the way that this is not how one creates the conditions for people to thrive in our social order. And once again, like DEI, another focus of his ire, is one more ruse of the powerful to gain more power while brutalizing and demonizing the populace whom they hate. All of hitherto society is a history of class struggle, and that's what's happening. Like a sort of the yeah, we can get into the DEI stuff, but all these things are expressions of Vance's Deanian sensibilities. And right now they match with technofeudalism, who are coming at them from a different side. What's the side that technofeudalism is coming at it from? An absolute libertarian commitment to meritocracy. That leads to a sort of a fusion. We have the gutting of USAID. Now, again, from Vance's perspective, you've got this massive propaganda enterprise fueling and encouraging liberalism around the globe. It's very much like the Comintern is the way USAID, functioned. It was basically this massive weaponized propaganda thing. And from Vance's perspective, this is part of bringing about, regime change, that we stop seeking to ideologically dominate globally from our liberal perspective. From Musk's perspective, it's going to save a shit ton of money.
Yeah.
So they're both actually, yay, let's tear apart USAID, but they're coming from different reasons, and that will be an increasing tension, I think, as time goes on. The classical conservatism, one might say classic liberalism, liberal conservatism, emphasized, significant small government. Regime change of the kind that Vance is interested in will call that into question, will call small government into question, by virtue of the fact that there needs to be the resources made possible for a commitment to eudaimonia that goes beyond economics, that goes beyond metrics, and so on and so forth. And this other, Muskian trajectory is going to be very much at odds with that. And so one of the interesting things over the next 4 years, again, it's a cliched image, but Vance being pulled by these two different forces. And so will Vance become what I would consider to be one more liberal, albeit a right-wing liberal, going along with the techno-feudalist elements, or will he stay faithful um, to a more Catholic vision? And that will require him being attentive and sensitive to the real authorities. And the real authorities aren't the nation state. They're not even the president. The real authorities are those who comprise the city of God, both on earth and through time. And so therefore it will be people like Augustine and Aquinas and even his bishops, who he needs to be more attentive to.
Very
So
interesting.
it's a fascinating struggle between these different visions.
Wow. Rodney?
Yeah, just a couple of questions. So it seems to me that, I'd have to, we'd have to think this through, or maybe you could help me think this through. It seems to me that the Augustinian bit sort of begins to break down a bit when you start embracing a kind of big government approach to the problem, right? So, and not to oversimplify things, but it seems to me from what I've read so far and what I can tell from the sort of the new polity crowd on the one hand, and then the Deane techno crowd on the other side, is first of all, where does Carl Schmitt fit into all of this? Because the new polity guys, I think, are going to suspect that there's a good bit of Schmitt going on in the other camp, and so with this kind of realism that it's not going to get done without breaking a few eggs, sort of thing. And that's just the nature of it. And don't try to get around that. And so that's where kind of the right-wing liberalism, I think, kind of sneaks back in.
By the way, Andrew Willard-Jones' latest book has a great chapter on Carl Schmitt.
Yes, yeah, I haven't read it yet, but I intend to. Yeah, I definitely want to
me
read
too.
that.
Yeah, I'm keen to read that.
But it seems, to go back to your point, David, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, that the new polity approach, from what I can tell, and they invoke de Lubac here, and that is I think this is where there might be a real tension, theologically. For de Lubac, there's a natural desire for God on the part of everybody who's a creature of God, right? So the way you would want a political regime to come about is through the natural desire for the good on the part of all people, coming up from below, right? And then those in authority aiding those people to reach their potentialities by looking out for the common good and the good of the citizens and things like that, right? So caring about the milkman, for instance, and the milkman wanting to be a virtuous milkman and longing for the good, and the king caring that the milkman can make a living, and kind of those, they come together kind of from top to bottom. And the reason that some people have more power than others isn't to exploit those below them, but precisely to empower them. For Aquinas, the higher you are up and the higher of being, the more responsibility you have for what is below you and all those things, right? So this is kind of the way Willard-Jones talks. So there's a kind of, because there's a natural desire for the good and even for God on the part of what is below. And then hopefully you would have a ruler who cares about that thing too, and kind of wants to do it from his end. This is precisely the reason you can't just change laws and use bureaucracy to do it, right? Because without grace, those requirements from above become burdensome, right? So there seems to be a more old school Thomistic view going on in the Pecknold side of things, where there's a dualism between nature and grace to some degree. And this is where I think you get a different kind of integralism, where integralism now becomes the king imposes the Catholic faith on the citizenry because the Catholic faith is above the authority of the temporal power. So you have spiritual power and temporal power. It's like a layer cake, right? There's no
Mhm.
desire for the spiritual power on the part of the lower layer cake, right? So it has to be imposed by force by the top. You know what I mean? So that it would almost be like a return to the old union of throne and altar approach to the thing. It seems to me. Now, I don't know how that fits into what Vance is doing with Trump right now. I mean, that's a question. But at least those are the ways I would characterize the tension between the two versions of post-liberalism. One is more de-Lubacian, one is more neo-scholastic Thomist. And you see this
Yeah,
in Pater
yeah, and
would be an example, I think, of that neo-scholastic approach to this.
yeah. In Sarah Shortall's book, Soldiers of God, she lays
Yeah.
this out beautifully. That these distinctions already show up in French politics, where you have Gary Lagrange down in Vichy, making nice with Marshal Pétain because he wants the ancien regime restored and integralism restored, and he's part of Action Française, whereas de Lubac is part of Catholic Action and believes it's got to bubble up from below, and all that old integralism stuff is dead, and we need to bury it and be done. So yeah, it seems like that question has returned. All right. And never. So I like that, Rodney, very much that you've brought the nature and grace issue into this conversation, because I think it's a very, very important distinction that's going to differentiate different forms of Catholic post-liberalism.
Yeah.
Yeah, I all my instincts are very much in line with what Rodney said, and on the new polity side of things, and even more, so in the tyranny of the banal, like I talk about politics as a brutal scramble to legislate and force the other side to live as if as if they believed what you believe. Um, I'm I'm still there, but I'm less confident than I was. And here's why. The if this so if the state, if the regime, for example, the Vance Trump regime, takes over a social order which is orchestrated against the common good. And so there are countless things which mean that working class people cannot have meaningful labor and instead must be reduced to the status of desperate, despairing consumer. Deane will in his book Regime Change, he will talk about the deaths of despair, which have gone through the roof. In Canada, and Canada's got a small population, there are 22 deaths every day from overdoses. There are significant amounts of, suicide, deaths of despair through the roof, and we don't even count medical assistance in dying as one of those forms of deaths of despair, when it is, to my mind, by definition, a death of despair. And so you have this absolute excruciating malaise of misery, which is not simply which which is not an accident, but which has been shaped by policy, and therefore, when one takes over a regime, there may be ways that one can change policies and legislation to facilitate a flourishing of the common good. Now, Vance is trying to do that, for example, in relation to immigration, which from his perspective, and again, I see the problems with this, but from his perspective, is a liberation of the working class. Is there a way that that monopolies, is our society another issue? Um, how does pornography, for example, affect our social order? Um, does it brutalize people? Does it raise misery? Is it a source of a whole host of pathological elements? And therefore, does the state need to be more interventionist, not in legislating the good, but in establishing the conditions in which people's natural goods can flourish. Now again, you can do this like you can go be too far on this. The figure that's in my head is less Garrigue Lagrange as Ireland's great leader for a significant part of the 20th century, Eamon de Valera. Eamon de Valera, he was very suspicious of economic growth. You know, he wanted the situation in which that people would keep their eyes on the prize, which was union with God, as opposed to consumerism and so on and so forth. Um, there may be ways in which a society is not totalitarian, but which can take actions at state level to facilitate a more free human being, free to appreciate the common good. And so that's the one thing that I would say in favor of the Deane, Pecknold, Amari, Vermeulen, perspective that it doesn't necessarily need to be the scary thing we're thinking about, but it may need to be deconstructive of the pathological elements in previous regimes and constructive of creating the conditions for human flourishing. Now, how far do you go? Who was it recently? Most of these figures that I've come across have come across through Larry. But one of the new polity folks was talking about the decline in friendship and talking about the way that we now, instead of needing to build up the bonds of friendship through asking someone for a ride, we will now pay for for an Uber and things of this nature. And so the entire way that, for me, capitalism rather than liberalism, but capitalism has created these conditions which are antagonistic to the flourishing of friendship and so on and so forth. And is there anything that the state can do to simply direct us in the right direction? Because liberalism is an unbridled affirmation of a Dionysian impulse to freedom understood as pleasure, which leads to an unbridled desperation for growth that we see in environmental catastrophe, the growth of Catholicism, the growth of military to the level that we now could destroy the world 1 billion times over. It's just this sheer unbridled rage that we associate with the modern West. These are things which have not served us well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I hear you. Yep.
I wonder, you mentioned before at the very beginning, that liberalism is a kind of bankrupt ideology. And people now see it as a bankrupt ideology that's clinging. You talk about totems and taboos. I often refer to it as a regime of a purely stipulative morality. We stipulate that murder's wrong. We don't really know why, and the fact that it's painful to some, but we're going to stipulate that it's wrong because it seems to work, or some utilitarian calculus. And that stipulative regime, that's bankrupt. That totem and taboo regime is bankrupt. Nevertheless, it's held in place with some pretty powerful super glue. Okay, it's held in place by the techno-globalist apparatus of corporate capitalism, the Eurocrats in Brussels, in league with the technocrats here in the United States, the surveillance capitalism that Shoshana Zuboff and others have pointed out. This is not going to die easily. And it's not going to brook interference with itself easily. I think for example, Germans and the UK now, in a sense, as J.D. Vance pointed out in his speech, eliminating free speech in some ways, because it's disinformation or it's bad information or it's wrong information. So we're going to throw your ass in jail if you publish a meme about migrants or something. So you've got that going on. You have in the UK someone being tossed into jail for praying silently outside of an abortion clinic, not disrupting anyone, not saying anything. So my worry is this, as you already see with the hysterical overreaction to the Trump-Vance thing, is my gut tells me that any sort of fledgling post-liberal political movement is going to be squashed like a bug. And I think I think it's going to take more than a J.D. Vance, in other words, or a few post-liberal Catholic types littering the political landscape in order to dislodge the powerful forces that still are in charge of things. In other words, I was interviewing Patrick Jones this morning. He was talking about the need to recognize the soft despotism of liberalism. And as it begins to die, that soft despotism is going to paint people like you and me and J.D. Vance as hard despotists. All right, so it's okay to be illiberal against the illiberals is the line. That's why it's not just hyperbole that they label us fascists and Nazis and so on. It's absolutely central to their project that we be seen that way, uh, because otherwise, their movement to control this slow descent out of liberalism is the gig is up. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling now, but maybe you could comment on some of that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that that was one of the fascinating and shocking things about about J.D. Vance's Munich speech, where he challenged Europe to, to say what is it for, what is it about, as opposed to these, despotic things. And the guy who got up after the German Minister for Defense, um, he simply said, we're about democracy. We're about the rule of law. Essentially, what he said was we don't have a story. We don't have a commitment to the good. We don't have an understanding of what we're for. We're just a space for capitalism, essentially, is what that
Yeah,
emerges at.
yeah,
Um, the truly terrifying thing that I think no one who likes J.D. Vance should say out loud is that he was criticized strongly in that speech for not addressing the Russia-Ukraine issue. And terrifyingly, to many, myself included, he kind of did, in that Russia, for all its manifold sins, has a sense of what it's about. It says, this
Mhm.
is who we are. Dugan, for example, will say, we are the third Rome. Rome was Rome, then Constantinople was Rome, and now that's us. And we are for this Christian civilization, so on and so forth. They've got a sense of who it is. The the global elite, bureaucrat, etc. They are simply a shell for capitalism and the manipulation of human desire for consumption. Um, J.D. Vance, in giving that speech against the backdrop of what's happening, may have been saying, we Americans have more in common with Russia
Mhm.
than we do with you, Brussels, and and Zelensky. And that's a holy shit moment. You know,
yeah,
that's a wow
yeah.
moment if that is the case. But the one thing I would add to what you're saying, Larry, in relation to the soft despotism, is that the greatest strength that liberalism has is the fact that we all on many levels simply want this. We want to stay in the matrix. We want to stay consuming. Um, we want to stay shopping on Amazon. We want or food that's killing us, but that gives us pleasure. And so it has the complicity of the masses. There was a very interesting conversation. It was on Deane's book Regime Change, and J.D. Vance was on the panel. And Deane in Regime Change said that in a kind of a ironic way, yes, the proletariat have arrived at class consciousness, and it's to say that you elites, you're full of shit. And Vance said, well, yes and no, don't be too happy about that, because he was saying that he was talking to an African American lady recently, who was saying that she was voting for him. And what he wanted to hear was all this, you know, working class coalition across the races over and against the elites that have downtrodden you. And what he got was simply, because I like you because you know what it's like to have been poor, And so don't assume that the working class have arrived at this class consciousness just because you really want to assume that.
Yeah.
And so then that's the Lenin problem. The Lenin problem is when you want to jump from feudalism to Marxism, skipping democracy, and the working class can only arrive at what he called trade union consciousness. How do you get the working? How do you change how we desire? If people desire video games and fast food and pornography, and they will cede everything, even though it's killing them, and then they'll die a death of despair at 35. But that's what they want because they're a duck just consuming for like fatty foods for foie gras. How do we get them to change? And I think that's where I think New Polity and everybody will be 100% right that actual change can only take place sacramentally, can only take place the Lubach via grace and so on and so forth. And so even though intellectually it has run aground, we need a change at the level of reflexive desire, and this can only take place through the virtues and so on and so forth.
As your book points out, the tyranny of the banal,
There you go.
exactly. As you know, the thing is, yeah, or put another way, the Christian narrative, robustly understood, not the Christian narrative of drag queen Episcopalians, but the Christian narrative, robustly understood in its classical sense, has got to become, once again, the narrative of our culture. The meme in everybody's brain, as Walter Lippmann said, the pictures in our head. That's what it has to become again. And until that happens, liberalism is going to provide those memes, which means, you're either trending upward towards God and transcendence, or you're trending towards your gut or your crotch or your veins. And I still think we're in the latter. We're still in that narrative, unfortunately, in that collective of concube. But Rodney, I don't want to go on a rant. Do you have? Well, I'm kind of done with that rant.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
That's a good rant. It's a good follow up to what David was saying, and I absolutely agree because I think now that really kind of puts me in I think it kind of gets me a sense of my bearings a little bit here. Is that part of the problem, and this is what with the genius of de Lubac and his friends during both pre-war and post-war, because pre-war many of the clerics were sidling up to right-wing regimes in order to because they get gifts from the powerful leaders, and stuff like that. They get land back and things like that. But then after the war, many, especially after Second Vatican Council, many of the church elites sidled up to Marxism, out of frustration because the church was dragging its feet, wasn't helping the poor enough, et cetera, et cetera. What kept de Lubac in this equilibrium under both circumstances was a radical prioritizing of the church as the body of Christ, and not some imaginary regime as the body of Christ or whatever, right? So, I mean, again, it's not that de Lubac would have objected to an organic situation where a king arises out of Christendom and really does care about the kingdom of God, and then rules temporal order with Catholic values. We're not going to turn that away. What do you do when Constantine converts? You don't tell him to unconvert. Right? Yeah. Or I guess you could, but whatever. But I think you got to something, David and Larry. This has been a constant harping of one of my heroes, David L. Schindler, that it really is has to be a culture first approach. And in other words, people have to be reconverted to the Beatitudes. And that's not going to happen as long as conservative Catholics are putting their eggs in Republican Party basket and liberal Catholics are putting their eggs in the Democratic Party. Because what's going to happen then is there's the culture, the social imaginary is going to be liberal either way.
Yeah.
It's going to be freedom to consume either way.
And Rodney, if I may interject, because I think you're really onto something here, we have to live the damn Beatitudes. Have to live the dadgum things, as you might say.
Right. So
Yeah.
in other words, what we need is a new social imaginary,
Yeah.
right? That makes it possible to think that happiness doesn't come from individual consumption choices, et cetera, et cetera. More and more freedom, more and more freedom to do this and that and the other. But again, it's not going to happen as long as the church, especially in America, David. I don't know if you've been here long in this country enough to see this experience, but man, are our clerics, they're Americanists. I don't care whether they're conservative or liberal. They are,
Yeah.
so Supich and those guys are left liberals through and through. And I'm not going to name the names of the right liberals, but we have those too. And the problem is neither one of them really wants to rock the boat and push back against capitalist culture.
Like
Because
Dolan, Cardinal Dolan to be a right-wing liberal. Yeah.
right, they don't want to really criticize capitalism and consumerism because then they're going to sound like communists. And again, the other side doesn't want to preach the virtues because they're going to sound like medieval Catholics and they want to be hipster, they want to be up to date, and all that. So it seems like maybe the priority, at least from my perspective, is for the church to get its own house together, and to quit putting politics first. Then I think we can actually help the political regime. But I don't think we can help the political regime if we don't have our house in order, I guess would be my thing. And my fear is that this impatience to make a change at the state level is then what you end up doing is just dropping half of your Catholic faith that doesn't fit with that particular regime. I worry a little bit about that with Vance. I think he wants to make changes. He's impatient to make changes, and I get that because people are suffering. But I worry that in doing so, he's keeping out of his mind one half of Catholic social doctrine and keeping in mind another half. But I'll let you respond to that because I'm not sure that's a fair accusation.
No, I think that's fantastic insight. I think that
But can I interrupt real quick? I mean,
please do. Yeah.
just look how fast JD Vance jettisoned his pro-life credentials in order to be on the Trump ticket. And I mean, that's not a left, right, but you see, like all of a sudden, well, wait a minute, JD, you're pro-life. And all of a sudden, boop, yep, I'm not. Trump's got it right. IVF, we're going to go with that. That really turned me off. But anyway, I'm sorry, David. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to and I do want to touch on, because I think the problem is his understanding of nationalism. The America First lens, I think, like frames that very, very well. I would suggest that what we're seeing in terms of, so most dioceses have seen an upturn in vocations, that we're seeing all these conversions, that again it's not massive numbers, but on the campus of Harvard and Yale and other Ivies, there are these developing cadres of traditionalist Catholic students and so on and so forth. And this is not the first time that we saw something similar, in that in the first few decades, particularly after the First World War, of the 20th century, there was a massive influx of people, and you have Merton, and you have vocations to religious life going through the roof, and you have all this movement into the church. And I would argue, furtively, that the church convinced these people they were wrong. in that one of the shadow sides to the culture of Vatican II was the affirmation that the church can only be 11 in the world, and the world is the main thing. And really what the church is for is social work and so on and so forth. And so all these people who came in looking for a radical alternative to the liberal social order, which was clearly failing, as we can see from the wars, etc., were convinced to go back out onto the factory floors and join unions and so on. So we saw the church push them out, essentially. Right now, in a situation where we're seeing people coming in again, and I think Rodney's 100% right that if we allow a Trumpian vision to dominate, what we are simply going to be doing is reinscribing the tyranny of secular liberalism, and so we need to find ways of opposing that. And I think that's I think that's a really important insight, and I think that somehow it would be very, very opposite if we could help the church in its evangelical enterprises and so on and so forth realize that there are many ways of bringing people into the church which simply reinscribes the tyranny of the banal, the tyranny of the secular, the tyranny of secular liberalism. And really, if we are interested in actually forming people who are ontologically distinct, which is the goal of the Christian life, conform to Christ through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, that we need to be thinking in different ways about this process. But once again, the church itself, and we think of many evangelical efforts, it's it succumbs to the capitalist logic. How do we get these people in? You know, how do we use capitalist metrics and capitalist ways to to get people to join this club, and yet in so doing, make them citizens of secular liberalism who just shout out praise Jesus every now and again. That was one of the great things and a real eye opener
Yeah.
for me in the I think it was in the prologue or maybe the introduction to Willard Jones's his the sacramental kingdom of Saint Louis the Ninth book,
Before there's church and state. Yeah.
before church and state. Like, he talks about the fact that that many specifically Christian things seed reality to the secular and then have a ghettoized Christian space within them. And it's vitally important that we have a different kind of church. But again, what we're talking about here, I think, will be relevant in 20 or 30 years, in terms of that in 20 or 30 years, there may be young men who are in seminary now who can be at leadership levels in the church, who can be seeking to implement these things. But I think what you said, Rodney, is 100% right. The way that sort of we reinscribe the tyranny of secular liberalism, as opposed to an alternative in the instinct, in the attempts to change things. And that's one of the pathologies of Vance. It's going to be endlessly fascinating what happens with Vance in the next 4 years.
I agree. I do. I think he's the most interesting political figure to come on the American scene in a very, very long time. He has there is the promise within him because he's so intelligent of actually effecting some real change in the American political landscape, which is why I think conversations like the one we're having today are so very important because I think we're at the very beginning of the J.D. Vance phenomenon.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important for us, for those of us in the Catholic sphere, to come forward for the aid of our non-Catholic, fellow citizens to say, all right, J.D. Vance is not a fascist. He's not a Nazi. Here's what he is. Right? You may still
Yeah.
not like it, but it's not because he's a Nazi. It's this other thing. So I think these kinds of conversations are interesting. But let me, unless Rodney has another question to follow up on that, he still can. But I'd like to throw out another question, which is this: we've used the language sort of a bankruptcy to describe the liberal project. Uh, I would put forward the proposition that one of the problems that we face isn't just the bankruptcy of liberalism, is that actually Western civilization as a whole is actually already dead. That Western civilization as a whole has, obviously there are pockets of sanity here and there. I'm not saying everybody is dead in Western civilization in a classical sense, but I mean the critical mass has been reached. We were beyond the tipping point, and it's impossible to retrieve in any viable way the institutions of Western civilization. They're moribund. They're terminal, if not already dead. That's actually the thesis of Paul Kingsnorth. I think it's the increasingly the diagnosis of some others. So assuming that proposition is true, and you're free to disagree with it, many do. Uh, what does the death of Western civilization look like? And as I mentioned earlier, the powers that be are not going to let go of power easily, but eventually they will have to. And so the question then becomes, what role for the church in the ashes and the ruins around us, because it's going to be different from the ashes and ruins of Rome. It's going to be it's an altogether different kind of nihilistic death of civilization, like one we've never seen before. I don't know. I'm kind of groping for the words to describe what I'm talking about. But Rodney, you want to add to
If you
that?
don't mind, I'll jump in there because I think I could then kind of piggyback off what David said at the very end about maybe this younger generation of
Yeah,
seminarians.
that's what prompted that
Yeah,
very
yeah,
comment
yeah.
prompted that in my
So
mind.
I do think that there are analogies between where we are right now as a civilization and where decadent late Roman Empire was.
Okay.
I don't, you don't want to overplay it, but I think there are analogies. And the analogies, at least that hop out to me, is that Rome had become kind of a shell of itself. It still had all the external trappings of being this great empire and stuff, but inside it was thin, and its values were vacuous and weren't satisfying people. And the blood and circuses weren't getting it done anymore, et cetera, et cetera. And then it extended itself too thin and blah, 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 all these different things, right? Um, and this is where I am attracted to the idea of the church today doing something like the church did at this time period, where they kind of preserved Western civilization in monastic communities and so a little bit like what these guys are doing out in Steubenville. They're creating a little community of people out there that are behaving as if liberalism isn't true. Right? I mean, they're working with their hands and et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera. Now, I'm not recommending that we all do this. Everybody's got to do something different or whatever. But the point would be something along the lines of it's going to get worse before it gets better, right? It's got to really come crashing down, because as long as we have the bread and circuses and they're kind of making us happy, or as long as we're zombies on our cell phones, we're not going to notice that nihilism is prevailing, right? But these young guys that are going into seminary now, from my experience, are people who have realized in no uncertain terms how decadent the culture has become, and they really are hungry for something real. They want to get in touch with reality. They don't want to just be playing video games all day long and watching porn. You know what I mean? That's not satisfying them. And that means that they're real converts. They really are converted Catholics. They believe the faith, maybe in rad-trad ways that are not always desirable and stuff, but at least they really believe. Whereas I really kind of believe that 2 generations ago, those priests were many of them were just culturally Catholic and just like,
Yeah.
well, this just means being a decent American. And they came into the seminary and kind of preached, be a decent American. That we got the be a decent American homilies for many, many years, right? These guys aren't preaching that way. They're preaching the gospel. And the seminarians that come to our, the cathedral and are working as deacons, they are not afraid to preach the gospel, and they know something's at stake. And so I'm hopeful, actually, that in 20 years, when these guys are the pastors of parishes and things like that, that we may get an uptick of genuine Catholicism, which can, I think, create a bit of a cultural revolution a little bit that would help to feed then the political order. But I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. That's just my diagnosis.
I
Yeah.
agree with that. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's a sense um, in which the world that the church is for is people who we would like to see coming to know Jesus Christ through the power of the Holy Spirit. Um, and yes, the social order which impedes these people from waking up, from coming to know Jesus Christ through the power of the Holy Spirit, this isn't disappearing anytime soon.
Mm-hmm.
And that can lead us to pessimism. On the other hand, and this could betray my Irish, background, there are very few examples of the West ever really being, robustly conducive to Christoformity. The
That is an excellent point.
and so when we think about the
Yeah.
when we think about the church in the 70s, for example, or the 60s, which is the high point of church attendance and confirmation classes that you'd have to rent out the local stadium to to run and things like this. This was a form of cultural Christianity, which wasn't just not Christiform. It was an impediment to like true Christiformity, and so I don't know. I've often wondered what the West is and what it means. USAID has spent hundreds of millions, if not many billions, on promoting the West in all its forms, and most of these things are so alien to the West that the current administration wants to annihilate them. And so, if anything, the West is has become the last 500 years this liberal space. And
Mhm.
so there's a sense in which to hell with it. Good riddance to this Western thing. Um, the where I really struggle online is with people who are overwhelming nationalists, who believe that when Aquinas or Augustine is speaking about citizenship, or membership of a community, that they were imagining a nation state of the size of the United States of America, which is which is crazy. The US came into being in one sense on the backs of many nations, indigenous nations that were there before, and then meandered along by forcing, what was it? Robert Lee said that he couldn't take up arms against his nation being Virginia. That it proceeded as a nation by forcing other nations to stay within it, whether it wanted to go or not. And so it is far more in common with an empire, or with the European Union in any meaningful sense. It's this place of plural cultures, of often oppositional cultures. And one of the things that are most tragic about Vance's perspective is that Augustine, for example, in early on in the city of God, in the against the pagans, he's talking about how Christians showed charity to strangers after the sack of Rome. And when he's talking about strangers, what he means are citizens of Rome who aren't Christians.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. Yeah.
he's imagining, and so from Augustine's perspective, say Elon Musk or Bill Maher, two atheists, they are not fellow citizens with JD Vance. The Mexican immigrant who's going to mass, he's part of an ontological body in which JD Vance subsists. These are literally ontologically one. This guy Vance, or this guy Musk, this guy Bill Maher, just because they have an American passport, who the hell are they to you? And so it's a complete absorption of Christian categories into the artificial categories of modern nation states, and that's a significant problem. And so there's a sense in which I think that the church, and again the Irish situation is going to influence me here, that we were a state which was run by the British Empire, which was part of the British Empire, and the church subsisted within it, in opposition to it by and large. And so that's something which is very, very comfortable to me. The only thing that I would say in favor of a J.D. Vance style solution where politics can help things is, or even Pope Francis's appeasement of the liberal social order. Is it possible that through these measures, people who would have seen the church as toxic could encounter the church as so detoxified that they may begin a journey which may lead to proper Christiformity,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so these morally problematic measures that we see with Pope Francis, that we see with J.D. Vance, on two opposite sides, but as creating the conditions fertile to conversion, that they may have some small role to play, but the real business, as we would all agree, is within this body, this ontological body made possible through the presence of the Holy Spirit in the world, conforming people to Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Amen. I couldn't agree more. That is so well put. And in my conversations this morning with Patrick Jones, freshly admitted CUA doctor, now heading to Franciscan Steubenville, who's an expert on the thought of Pierre Monnet. We were discussing how in Monnet talks a lot about political form, different kinds of political form, and he juxtaposes empire against nation, against the polis, or the different levels. The nation, the concept of a nation, is far more capable of integrating the pluralism of the various polises within its than is empire. The empire has to rule through kratos, power, in order to hold things together. Whereas the nation, which raises the question of whether or not the United States really is a nation in Pierre Monet's sense, it closer to empire than to nation. And maybe California should be its own nation, and Texas its own nation, and and this kind of thing. But what I'm ultimately driving at here, and what Patrick Jones was talking about, is what we need, and Pope Francis violates this, and it's a violation we see in papal statements going all the way back to Pachamentaris and John the 23rd. We need a robust recovery, as Andrew Willett-Jones points out, of the proper sense of subsidiarity. The subsidiarity doesn't mean, well, the big government can't do it, so we'll have the little government do it. Like society's just a series of Russian nesting dolls. That's not subsidiarity means whatever is appropriate to a particular level, that level should do. The propria. What is the propria of the polis? What are the propria of the polis? What are the propria of the nation? And whatever those are, those need to be empowered. In other words, so my point would be the only way to avoid, in a Catholic post-liberalism, the specter of a hard integralism and a return to all of that nonsense, is it seems to me we have to recover a far more sophisticated articulation of the various political forms and what the propria are to each one of the forms, and a proper sense of subsidiarity. And I think the only thing that I see out there that advocates something is some kind of distributism or paleo-anarchism, whatever you want to call it. It's not the technofeudalism of people like Elon Musk. It's something else. Anyway, you see what I'm talking about here, David?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I think the challenge, I think it's easiest to be what a nation may aim to be in the microcosm. And so within the family, if one of my daughters is desperately unhappy, then I cannot be happy. My happiness is dependent upon her. So too, if she is happy, I am happy. And so the family is directed towards the common good by virtue of the fact that it's a good that is dependent on each other and that is therefore shared communally in a very coherent way. And so the family can be an expression of that thing. When it seeks to operate at the level of the polis, then it becomes much more difficult, and one might wonder whether in contemporary cities that can happen in a meaningful way. An example of this would be, again, in California, which is a grotesque housing problem, and it has people who will vote constantly saying how important housing is and who will vote Democrat because housing is so important to democratic policy. And yet, if anyone was to suggest bringing in affordable housing into their neighborhood, they will oppose that at the local level.
Yeah.
And so within the family, by nature, we have all these gifts and capacities to realize the common good within the family. To do it at the level of the of the polis requires grace that all these people don't have and can't have. And then
Yeah.
once that gets up to the level of states, and then this unity of states, it becomes almost impossible, I think, to speak about in any meaningful sense. Without the radical transformation. And so this is the thing that I constantly wonder about, is how do post-liberals migrate that which is in Aquinas's head and Augustine's head, who are imagining these microcosmic embodiments of the common good, from friendship to family to the community to all these things, how they migrate that up to these modern golems of the nation state. They can come together, I would suggest, when there's a good shared threat. So give us a
Yeah.
good, if the orcs are at the door, then we can sort of have some sort of notion of the common good between us. Outside of that, I think I'm not sure it's all that meaningful. Which again, the Eucharistic body, the body that converges around the altar, the parish, like these are units which can become embodiments of the common good.
Yeah.
Let's let that be our last word. Especially the Eucharistic altar part. I just got a text from Rodney saying he's got to go. I gotta go. All right, and we've been at this about an hour, 20 minutes or so. So yeah, it's kind of time to wrap this up. But I like the way you ended that, David. To gather around the Eucharistic table. I once said at a conference where Joe Fessio was there, I was giving a paper on John Paul II, something, I don't know what it was, but somebody asked me a question at Q&A about, well, what can we do? I said, well, in the world of John Paul II, what he would say is go to church.
Amen.
Start. Do you go to church? Go to church. Go to mass. It's the most politically defiant thing we can do, and defining and culture building. Anyways, I guess I'll give myself the last word. David, thank you. As always, you are brilliant and fascinating, sir.
Thank you, guys. Really
And,
appreciate it. Thank you, Rodney. Thank you, Larry. Thank you
all
so
right.
much.
All right.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Thank you for that sabbatical. You updated us on JD Vance. That's super helpful.
Yeah,
Excellent.
very good.
It
Yeah.
is, yeah.
All right, guys,
Thanks so
as
much, guys.
always. Bye.